Okay, why are we so lured by the single? First off, let me make my case that we're lured by a single causation. How often do you hear in the news people discussing some kind of crisis that has happened having to do with anything having to do with human behavior? School shooting or a war or people texting and driving or whatever you might want to talk about. There's always a debate that is focused on which single causation that if we changed it would make the negative behavior go away. If we had stronger gun laws, we wouldn't have any guns. That's a little simplistic, isn't it? That's the lure of the single causation. If only we had the law, we wouldn't have the behavior. If only we had intact families, we wouldn't have these negative outcomes. If only we had whatever factor present, we wouldn't be having this negative outcome. We hear it all the time. I'm going to focus specifically on one that is oftentimes directed at psychology, which is are we the way that we are because of nature, or are we the way that we are because of nurture? Like one or the other is the important factor. All of us who are psych majors know it's a combination, right? It's a mixture of your predispositions and then the setting you find yourself in, but it's still really tempting to pick sides and decide which one's more important. I thought I'd give you just a couple of examples of how, just three ways that genes and environment might interact to help make the case that really there's almost always more than one explanation, more than one factor that goes into an outcome. So one way that the gene and the environment interact is through what we call a passive genetic influence. Just true disclosure here, just to find pictures of people who illustrate my concepts. I rated Google Images, and so I don't know who any of these people are in these pictures. They're just doing something I needed them to be doing. So let's pretend that I know who these people are. And let's pretend that mom plays the piano and is good at it, and so that's why there's a piano in the house. And her son is already showing interest in the piano, and she's encouraging that. See, she's got him up on her lap, and she's showing him how to plunk away at the piano, and she's really fostering his interest in something that she probably gave him a genetic predisposition for. This is what we call a passive genetic influence, because the child doesn't really have to do anything to elicit the feedback from the environment that he needs to fully reach his genetic potential. He can just exist in that environment, and that environment will foster his genetic potential. That's what we call a passive genetic influence. A reactive genetic influence is where here we have another little child who I don't know. We're going to pretend like she inherited from her parents a musical gene. But neither of her parents are actually very musical, so they didn't have any instruments in the house and they really didn't know anything about it. But once she started showing an interest in playing a piano, they were like, well, let's foster this. And so once she displayed her predisposition, they ran out and got her a training piano. I think that's just a toy, but we're making up a story here. So they ran out and they got her a little training piano, and they already started her on lessons. And so through her predisposition, she got the environment to react and provide her what she needs. So that's another way that the gene and the environment can interact. The final way that the gene and the environment might interact in this little model is what's called an active genetic influence. And in this case, you've got, see the guy playing the piano here. Here's my story. He always wanted to play the piano. He had a natural predisposition towards it, but his environment not only didn't foster it, but it actually told him that he shouldn't be wasting his time on that, and you should be studying and things like that. And so he never was encouraged in his predisposition. Here he is now, fully grown adult, and he says, that's it, I'm getting a piano and I'm taking lessons. That's his piano teacher sitting next to him. This is my story, I'm making this up. But as an adult, he had to be completely active in helping himself to ensure that his genetic predispositions were met. These are three different ways that the gene and the environment might interact. There are actually other theories on how genes and environment interact, but my point in using this illustration is that I just really want to make the case that we don't have to pick sides in psychology because there isn't a side. There are multiple factors that determine outcomes. Even when you're pressed by your friends to pick a side and say, when they tell you it's a cop-out, to say, well, it's a combination. It's not a cop-out. You're being a good scientist when you say, you know what, both of them play a role. You can take a side in the form of, I think one is more important than the other, something like that, but that it really comes down to an interaction. That's completely normal because that's the scientific way to look at it. In class, I like to show a little videotape where the video is talking about whether it really whether peers are more influential on us growing up or parents are. And it's such a hot button issue because the research has suggested that parents' biggest influence is through their genes, and that the environmental influence that is important to kids tends to be their non-shared environment. That doesn't mean that the environment inside the household isn't important, though. That's a layperson's misunderstanding of what the data says. What the data says is that once you've accounted for differences between siblings, let's say, who were raised in the same household, once you've eliminated genes as the contributing factor in any differences between those siblings, there's really nothing left to say about their differences by looking at the way that their parents treated them. There's really no variability left to be explained by parenting once you've taken out the role of the parents' genes. So what's left to explain variability between siblings is outside influences. Now, does that mean that parents don't matter? Absolutely not. It means that we can't separate it out statistically to figure out what part of the parental influence that came from genes is more important and what part is that came from nurturing is more important. That's the part we can't figure out. We know both of them are important. So yes, parents do matter. Now, I found this in my beloved Discover magazine. I wanted to share it with you guys. Here's a great example of researchers using multiple methods to figure out the answer to something. So I truncated this. This is a full article. I just pulled out the paragraph of interest. So the scientists wanted to figure out what role neurogenesis plays in rodent behavior. So they had to figure out ways to make new neurons stop growing. So here's where the multiple methods come in. One group of researchers focused on manipulating their genes. So they turned off the genes that would normally cause new neurons to grow. Others exposed them to powerful X-rays so that any new cells that were growing would be killed. Others used cell-destroying drugs to shut off the development of new neurons. Multiple methods to achieve the same goal. What's interesting, if you look back at when I take this off, oops, sorry. All of the studies found that meddling impairs the animal's capacity to identify subtle differences between situations, and that the reverse, that boosting neurogenesis appears to help them discriminate more deftly between very similar scenarios. So using all three techniques to kill the neurons, the growing neurons, produce the same conclusion, which gives us more confidence in that conclusion because multiple methods were used. We can't say, well, maybe there was something else besides just the neurogenetic genes that were turned off when you turned off the genes that lead to neurogenesis. Maybe exposing them to powerful X-rays damaged other stuff. Maybe the cell-destroying drugs had wider effects. When we've used three different techniques, you can't say it's the drug's fault or the X-ray's fault or the gene's fault. You have to say that it was the turning off of the neurogenesis that seems to be the critical factor no matter what method you use and what other ancillary stuff happens as a function of that. That's the beauty of the multiple method.